Hello and welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Lately, I've been noticing a lot of politicians loudly proclaiming their support for Israel. Now, it's pretty common for them to do so, but lately it just seems more aggressive than usual. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has spent quite a bit of his campaign time talking about his support for Israel. Hakeem Jeffries, he's second in line to Nancy Pelosi, last week took a trip to Israel with other members of Congress where he also proclaimed his support for the country. Ron DeSantis even took a trip a few months ago, which was unprecedented for someone simply campaigning. So since it's been such a constant topic lately, I think it's fitting we discuss it. But rather than get an Israeli who is a supporter of Israel or a Palestinian who isn't, let's talk to an Israeli who's critical of his own country. With us tonight is Miko Peled. Miko was born and raised in Israel to a very prominent Zionist family. In fact, his grandfather signed Israel's Declaration of Independence, and his father served as a prominent general in the Six-Day War. Miko himself served in Israel's Special Forces. His family was struck by tragedy when his 13-year-old niece was killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber. Nonetheless, Miko and his family are activists for Palestinian rights, and Miko is a staunch supporter of a one-state solution. He's the author of The General's Son, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and Injustice, The Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. Very excited for tonight's conversation. But first, let me get to tonight's sponsors. CBDistillery.com. I am someone who doesn't sleep well, and my dog, she's getting older, she's got aches and pains, and so this is why I turned to CBDistillery.com for a natural way to help me get some sleep and also to give my dog Scarlett the relief that she needs for her aches and pains. I'm not quite there yet in age or injuries, but one day I will be, and so I'll be using it probably for aches and pains. But at this point for me, it's for sleep and relaxation. For my dog, it's for her arthritis. And CB Distillery has over 2 million satisfied customers. 90% of customers report they do sleep better with CBD. 81% said CBD helps them with stress. 80% said CBD helps with aches and pains after physical activity. So if you struggle to get a good night's sleep, or if you're dealing with too much stress and you just want some calm, and if you suffer with maybe aches and pains or discomfort, maybe after physical exercise, try CBD from the source that I trust, cbdistillery.com. And you're going to get 20% off your order when you enter my name, Kim, at checkout. No prescription required. That's cbdistillery.com. Promo code Kim for 20% off. All right, let me tell you also about Field of Greens. I love this stuff. I love the Field of Greens powder. I'm going to tell you about that, but I also love their other new product called Lean, which is one of my favorites. But the powder itself is dehydrated whole fruits and vegetables, all organic. It has probiotics, prebiotics. It's just a really, really great product that's going to give you all of the things that you need in order to get the best, nutrients in your diet possible, because you're probably not eating all your fruits and veggies. Probably not taking your probiotics and prebiotics. All you do is just take a scoop of this, mix it into your ice water, shake it up. It's kind of like it's a tea in consistency. You drink it and bam, you got all the things that you need in your diet to get your, for that boost, so that you're not worrying about all the yogurt you got to eat and all the fruits and vegetables you got to eat. That is what I love about Field of Greens. But they also have a product called Lean, which I really love. They're these pills that you take. They really boost your metabolism. They give you energy. You don't get the shakes. I don't get the shakes, at least when I take it, which is what I really like about it. But it also does curb your appetite. So it's a bit of an appetite suppressant, boosts up the metabolism, really gives you that energy. So Lean is a really awesome, awesome product that I have also been taking regularly now. And I really do like that. So I love both of these products. You can get them both at their website, fieldofgreens.com. Use the promo code Kim, and you will get 15% off your first order. So again, go to fieldofgreens.com, promo code Kim for 15% off your first order. All right, really excited about tonight's guest, Miko Peled. Miko, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Let's start off with how you ended up getting to where you are today as an activist, as a supporter of the one-state solution. Kind of give us the background of your family and your history in Israel.
Sure. I was born in Jerusalem to a very, very prominent Zionist family. I have a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a president of the state. My father was a general, and other members of the family who held, important positions both in the establishment of Israel and in the early decades of the state. And so I was as staunch patriotic Zionist as you could possibly be. And then gradually, as the subtitle of my book, The General Son, suggests, I began what I call the journey of an Israeli into Palestine. And the journey of an Israeli into Palestine really forces us to think about two things. Number one, what's an Israeli? What is Israel? And what is Palestine? Where is Palestine? And that journey, which is actually began in the United States with my first meetings with Palestinians, took me to this realm of the other that I was never a part of. I never knew about. I never learned about. And even though I was born and raised in Jerusalem, which many people think is a mixed city, and in many ways it is, but it's a completely segregated city, just like the rest of the country is segregated. So I was, minutes away from Palestinian neighborhoods, but our lives were different. We never met. I mean, the segregation was complete. And then, like I said, I started meeting Palestinians here in the United States. That's really where the journey began. And then gradually began to hear this other story, this other narrative. Now, coming from the family that I came from, um, I had no doubt that I had full possession of the truth. And suddenly I'm sitting across the table with some very nice people, very intelligent people, and they're literally telling me that night is day and day is night. And what many Israelis, this was the context was a Jewish Palestinian dialogue group that in the early 2000s was very popular in Southern California. And I couldn't dismiss these people as many other Jews and Israelis did. These people, I mean the Palestinians. And I began to look into it deeper and look into it deeper. And then I read what some of the, new Israeli historians were writing, people like Ilan Pappé and others, and kind of began to meet Palestinians, to travel myself into Palestinian cities, both within 1948, which is called Israel, and within the West Bank, and of course Jerusalem. And I realized that I was born as an Israeli in Palestine, that the entire country was Palestine, and it's just had been occupied and renamed. And thus the journey of an Israeli, which is this really new creation of a people, people who came to colonize Palestine, Jewish people who came to colonize Palestine, who are now this new people that exist and live in Palestine. And we are in Palestine, and we are occupiers, and we are colonizers. And there's no such thing as a good occupation. There's no such thing as a, benign colonizer. That doesn't exist. And gradually, step by step, through these interactions, through the travel, through speaking with Palestinians, and I remember the minute this happened, actually, the actual moment that I realized the one state, two state conversation is the wrong conversation. The reality is that there exists a one state over all of Palestine, and that's the apartheid state of Israel. The two state is a myth. There is no option for a two state. Even if there was one a long time ago, Israel made it impossible, completely took it off the table with facts on the ground. And so the option is a one state, which is called Israel, gives privileges to people like myself at the expense of Palestinians, which is apartheid, which is a crime against humanity. Or we fight for, if we believe in democracy and we believe in equal rights and we believe in justice, then we fight for a single democracy with equal rights, a free Palestine, a free democratic Palestine with equal rights, and mechanisms for allowing refugees to return. So that was kind of an intersection for me, a fork in the road, where I had to choose, where do my values lie? Yes, my family was a big part of the creation of this new thing, of the state of Israel. But basically, the narrative, the story of the creation of Israel, the story of the Jews coming to colonize as opposed to the Jews coming to make the desert bloom. I had to make a choice. Where do I feel comfortable in terms of my values? And my values led me to believe that only a single democracy, a free democratic Palestine with equal rights, is the only other option if we don't accept the violence and racism.
And we can get into that because I still do believe in a two-state solution. So we could kind of debate this as the time goes on here. But I want to get into your childhood and growing up. Where did your family originally come from?
On my mother's side, they came from Belarus. On my father's side, they came from Ukraine. But basically, Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe. That's we're Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah, and so who
And
immigrated into Israel? Was it your grandfather who signed the
my
Declaration of
grandparents,
Independence?
yeah.
Your grandparents came
Yes,
in.
the
Okay.
generation of my grandparents is what's called the third immigration, the third migration, or the third aliyah, and these were really really dedicated and idealistic, if you can use that word, Zionists who came to establish a Jewish state. I mean, I have a poster hidden somewhere of advertising a lecture by my grandfather in 1920 in Kiev or something. He was part of this group of Zionist young Zionist diplomats, and he was a doctor by then, and they were all doctors and chemists, and very highly
Hmm.
intelligent, highly educated. They spoke 5 languages. They didn't look like Jews. They shaved their beards, and they were going around the world convincing the Europeans that Zionism is the right thing, and trying to convince Jews around the world that they need to leave their homes and their life, mind you, in Europe. They were not talking about
Hmm.
other countries, to come to Palestine to create a state for Jewish people. So I grew
And
up
this was
with that,
before the Holocaust, right? I mean, this is, and I think
this
this
is
is an
long
important
before the
point.
Holocaust.
Yeah, this is an
Oh,
important point
yes.
to bring up because a lot of people believe that this was created after the Holocaust, that this was a reaction, that the state of Israel is a reaction to the Holocaust, that is when the world realized, well, the Jews need a home where they can be safe, a home of their own, where they're not going to have this type of persecution. But what you're laying out is that this was going on in the 20s. This was way before the Holocaust.
Oh, yes. I mean, my father, both my parents were born in Palestine. I mean, on their passport, the original passport and birth certificate, it says Palestine. And my father was born in Haifa, which is a very old Palestinian city. My mother was born in Jerusalem before the ethnic cleansing. So there were very large Palestinian neighborhoods in West Jerusalem, which were all completely ethnically cleansed in 1948. And they were the first generation Israelis, if you will. I mean, there was no Israel yet, but they were these, very zealots. My father went, and in high school he began his military training. It was covert military training. And these were people, and my mother was part of this youth movement that would go around and telling Jews they should stop talking any other language but Hebrew. And so they were zealots, and they were determined to build and create a state for Jews, a state for Jews in Palestine.
What was the reasoning when they were going around Europe and trying to convince all these Jews to move to Palestine and create Israel? What was the reasoning back before the Holocaust?
Well, there are many reasons. I mean, the early Zionists felt excluded, even though they were highly educated, and they were supposedly immersed in the cultures where they lived. They still, to a certain degree, felt excluded, and they created an organization, which, by the way, most Jewish people rejected completely, and many Jewish people reject even to this day. And they this idea that Zionism is the future of the Jewish people. And what's very interesting about that is that the vast majority of Jewish people, especially in Central Europe at the time, were Orthodox Jews, were religious people. The idea of these kind of secular Jews was kind of rather modern, enlightened, what they call enlightened Jews. And by 1920, Zionism was really just at beginning its first steps. Um, all the major rabbis of Europe came out with a book warning Jewish people about the dangers of Zionism. And they said basically 3 things. They said Zionism, or this idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, is going to bring violence to the Holy Land, which it
Mm,
did.
yeah.
It will ruin the good relations that exist between Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims around the world. There are large communities, massive communities of Jewish people, everywhere in Iraq, in Northern Africa, in Yemen, in Iran, and so on. And they said it will cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jewish people who are citizens of the world. Are they
Mm.
citizens of this new thing, or are they citizens of where they belong? And it was like prophetic, because those 3 things have been happening, as we all know, including the third one, which is very dangerous because it made it very difficult for Jewish people to sometimes say, well, we have nothing to do with this new thing. We are Iraqi Jews, or whatever the case may be, or American Jews today, or so forth and so forth. So, but that was they wanted this new modern European place for Jewish people to live as Europeans and thrive and have independence, some kind of independence. That was their motivation.
Mm. So, You grow up in Jerusalem. You say that you did have some interaction. You didn't have much interaction with Palestinians. Of course, you saw them; they were around. What was your impression of Palestinian people while you were growing up?
First of all, we never used the word Palestinians. They were Arabs, or the Arabs of Israel. Until I was, I think, maybe in high school, late in high school, it was the first time the word Palestinian, came into the discourse, but very, very little. Mostly it's the Arabs or the Arabs of Israel, which of course is very denigrating. It's a terrible thing to call Palestinians the Arabs of Israel. And I knew what everybody knew, that they were dangerous, that they were lazy, that they were dirty, that they were liars, that you can't trust them. They came in and out of the frame of our lives. They did the landscaping, they collected the trash, they did the construction. In those days, we never knew or learned or heard about a Palestinian poet, a writer, a philosopher, mathematician, a doctor. That was not in our sphere whatsoever. And again, I'll say this again, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, minutes away from a large Palestinian population in East Jerusalem that was full of writers and poets and teachers and educators and so on and so forth, highly educated people. We had nothing to do with that, and we didn't even know that that element existed within this Arab society, who, again, we look down at because look at us. We live in this modern country with modern, very standard of living is very high, very European, very liberal, and they're stuck in this backward, lifestyle. And why can't they get their act together? What we didn't know, of course, is that we deny them access to water, we deny them access to funding, we deny them access to all these different things that are, that we take for granted.
Um, what you've got a kid there trying to get your attention.
I got a 3-year-old.
Cute. um, so growing up, you just had this sort of you just saw them kind of in the fray or in the fringes. You didn't really. So that's very interesting because you're right. Jerusalem is this mixed city in a way. I mean, East Jerusalem is heavily Palestinian even today. How did you then, when you went to tell us about your time as in the Special Forces?
Well, the Special Forces part, I was going to say, I didn't really serve that long in the Special Forces. I was, out of 3 years, I did 1 year, then I had knee surgery, and I became part of I was part of the medical corps. But serving in the military was an eye opener. I relate to this in my book. I have a chapter in the General Sun talking about the military service. I call it the Red Beret. And so the Red Beret is something that as a child, as an early kid, you grow, you want, because the Red Beret is what the Special Forces wear, the paratroopers. It's like a big deal. So anyway, so we're marching, in basic training, you march a lot, especially if you're training to be part of Special Forces. So you march a lot, you march at night, you march carrying heavy equipment. It's very taxing. And I'm noting, and all the training was in the West Bank. The base was in the West Bank, and we're marching through cultivated fields, and we're destroying cultivated fields. And I remember the first time I was so naive, I went up to my sergeant. I said, "We're trampling over cultivated fields here." Because he told me to shut up and keep walking. And then I remember we were doing, even as relatively new recruits, several months in, we would do this patrolling in Palestinian cities. And I remember our lieutenant briefing us and saying, "Anybody looks at you, you break every bone in their body." And they gave us batons and these plastic handcuffs. And I'm thinking, we are a Special Forces unit, we're an infantry unit. What are we doing with batons and handcuffs? What the hell? I had no idea what was going on, which of course you can't ask. And off we went, and I thought to myself, we're going to be patrolling through a populated city. And we look like, we're just fully armed, heavily armed paratroopers walking through a city. Everybody's going to look at us. Who's not going to look at us? What are we supposed to do? Break everybody's bones? I mean, it was an unbelievable. And so it was through experiences like this that I suddenly began to realize this whole myth of the Israeli army of being a benign moral army is an absolute lie. It is an absolute lie. And little by little, I came to terms with that. And then the last year of my service, I was no longer in that unit. I had knee surgery, so I became a corpsman, and I was teaching at a kind of an academy where they taught corpsmen. last year of my service was 1982, and Israel invaded Lebanon, and it was just a complete break of whatever was left in me, the believing in the Israeli military, or believing in the legitimacy of an Israeli military, and so on. And then there was a massacre of Sabra and Shatila, and on and on and on, and it made it clear that this was all one big lie. So the military service began for me with this sense of enthusiasm and idealistic enthusiasm, and ended with a real break in the whole thing. And during my service last year, there were massive protests against the war. There were massive protests against the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, which Israel had a very important big part in. And so that was kind of the beginning of that disillusionment for me.
So members of your family also, your father became a peace, an advocate for peace with the Palestinians, from my understanding. Your
Yeah.
sister, who tragically lost her daughter in a suicide bombing, blamed Netanyahu, actually blamed Israel and not the Palestinians for that. Were you the first one to, in your family, sort of have this shift, or was it other members of your family who had the shift before you did?
Well, it was a gradual process for all of us. I mean, certainly my father had a legacy as a military man. He was one of the generals who pushed very hard for Israel to begin the assault on the Arab armies in 1967, and what became known as the Six-Day War. The Israeli army pushed very hard, and he was one of the strongest, loudest voices pushing Israel to start this massive assault against its neighbors, mostly because he knew, as the other generals knew, that the Arab armies were weak and it would be an easy war, and they were going to win, and will be able to destroy the Arab armies and occupy all this land. And so, but when the war ended 5 days later, because the war was not a 6-day war, it was a 5-day war, and we could talk about the name in a little bit. He stood up at the first meeting of the Israeli High Command saying, now that we won, now that we're really powerful, we need to talk to the Palestinian leaderships locally about the idea of partitioning the country, but on conditions that are better for us. And so the West Bank and the Gaza Strip could be a Palestinian state. And he was told, to be quiet. I mean, nobody wants to talk about that kind of thing. And he kept insisting and insisting. And then he retired a year later. And for the rest of his life, that was his second legacy as a man who demanded war at one point, but then shifted and decided that peace was better. And his point was, we have two choices. One is to remain a Jewish democracy in a part of the country, which was the vast majority of the country, which was occupied in 1948, or to not be a Jewish democracy, not have a Jewish majority, and keep the entire country, because the Palestinians, it was obvious, were going to be demographically a majority. But the Israeli establishment didn't want to know anything about that. They began building settlements. The ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, of East Jerusalem, was massive. Hundreds of thousands were thrown out. Massive building for Jews only in East Jerusalem, everywhere throughout the West Bank. I mean, this was not something that they even stopped for a minute. There was no hesitation. Settlements in Hebron, settlements around Nablus. Of course, all of East Jerusalem was expanded. And it was clear that nobody was interested in the two-state solution. They wanted the land, as much of it, and they were going to get the people out, one way or another. Like you said, later on, after my father passed away, 2 years after my father passed away, my sister's little girl Smadar was killed in a suicide bombing. And people always ask me, how did you shift? How did you become kind of an anti-Zionist? How did you become? Well, this is exactly something. Sadly, something terrible usually have to happen for us to take big shifts in our thinking, and that was precisely the kind of massive shift, massive trauma. You carry that small coffin of a little girl to its final resting place. You can't get up the next day and say, oh, well, let's go back to work. That's not going to happen. And so we all, and then my sister came out and she said, people talk about revenge and retaliation and everybody's all gung-ho in Israel. And she said, slow down. And she said this in front of her apartment was packed with journalists from the entire world, because the granddaughter of a general who was also a peace man was killed by Palestinians. It's big news. And she stood up and she said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Don't talk to me about killing more people, certainly not in response to the killing of a little girl. I mean, that's grotesque. And then she said, you want to know who's to blame? And Netanyahu, by the way, was prime minister then. That was his first term way back then. She said, well, what do you expect? What do Israelis expect when you maintain a brutal occupation, when you keep people, political prisoners, when you kill people's children, when you take away their lands and their homes? You expect that there'll be no retaliation? You expect that there'll be no violent reaction at all? It's absurd. And so she said, Israel is responsible for the death of our daughter, just as Israel is responsible for the death of all these countless of Palestinians. So, of course, now it became even bigger. This whole story became even bigger. I came back here to the US. I was living in California at the time, and I was just at a loss. Where do you go from here? How do you keep going pretending nothing happened? And gradually I found this dialogue group that I mentioned earlier, and that was home for me. It's like finding people who cared, finding people who want to speak, finding people who saw home the way I saw home, which were mostly the Palestinians, not so much American Jews, but the Palestinians. And so that was, but we all kind of shifted around the same time. Many, to a certain degree, some more, some less. But that was kind of the progression of how it happened. And again, just to clarify, I think that the two-state solution, just to make it very clear, is a Zionist construct. It's designed in order to legitimize the initial sin, the original sin of the occupation and ethnic cleansing of 1948.
Right.
Because now we're saying, well, the past is behind us. We're not going to worry about that. We're just going to worry about these other territories. And that, to me, is not good enough.
So when you talk to others, outside of your family, other Israelis, American Jews, and you give them your perspective now that you're an anti-Zionist, do you find that they agree with you? Are they vehemently against you? Are they somewhere in the middle? Like, what do you come across in your life?
Well, all of the above, I should say. I mean, clearly all of the above. And I think it's also obvious that the what's known as the mainstream Jewish voice in America is, of course, very pro-Zionist. Very Zionist, not pro-Zionist, very Zionist, actively Zionist. So they don't, they don't really want a conversation with me. They don't want to talk to me. Israelis, when they hear me, they're shocked. And the comment that I hear from progressive Israelis mostly. I mean, it's not to say that aren't Israelis that speak like me, but they're very few. But kind of the more mainstream, if you can say that, mainstream progressive Israelis always say, I agree with you 95%. I agree with you 95%. And I always think to myself, damn that 5%. What is that 5% about?
Right.
It's about viewing the other as equal. It's about realizing that Palestinians have rights as human beings, that we do not have a right to do what we're doing. That's exactly the 5%. They're not willing to give up their superiority. They're not willing to give up the apartheid, the joy of the apartheid when you're on the privileged side, as we are as Israelis. Mm-hmm. And that's the 5%. But, people are, across the board.
Do you think it's just that not enough Israelis have gone over into Palestine and seen the occupation? And which is, on one hand, I could say, well, not very many have seen it, but practically every Israeli serves in the IDF, right? So they would have to have seen it, I would think, at some point and have participated in it. But at the same time, it's also very dangerous for Israelis to go over into these Palestinian cities. There's big, when you're over there, the big red signs that say, warning, do not go here. This is territory that belongs to the Palestinians. And if you cross in here, your life is in danger. I mean, they have these giant signs telling people to do this. And from my experience when I was there, Palestinians told me that there is some truth to that there is so much hostility between the two groups that it would be dangerous for an Israeli to find themselves wandering accidentally even into a Palestinian zone. One of my Palestinian guides mentioned how he had actually rescued an Israeli he clearly could see that he had gone off the wrong path and was lost and didn't know where he was. And he flagged him down and said, you need to get out of here. Like, this is not good for you to be here. And obviously there's that same in the reverse, that Palestinians that find themselves wandering maybe in the wrong spot. It's a very hostile, dangerous situation. So I would imagine it's difficult for Israelis to even go over and witness the occupation from the viewpoint, the vantage point of a Palestinian and what they have to go through every day. Do you think, how can
Well,
that bridge be? Yeah, go ahead.
first of all, I have to disagree with you, Kim. There is no danger for Israelis to go into any Palestinian city. I go into Palestinian cities with an Israeli license plate, and nobody knows who the hell I am. And I've never once encountered, and I've gotten lost, and I've asked for directions, and they can see I'm an Israeli. I mean, there's no way that I'm not an Israeli, even though I speak Arabic. I'm an Israeli, and it is so untrue. Now, it has happened that soldiers have entered, and I
Right.
don't
Yeah.
believe for one second that they wandered in, innocently and made a mistake. Because, like you said, there are all these big signs. You cannot enter a Palestinian city by mistake. It doesn't happen. It's impossible. The signs are there. The roads are different. A couple of miles before you're there that you're on your way to a Palestinian area, whether it's Nazareth, whether it's in the south, in the Nakab, the Bedouin Palestinians, whether it's in Lid. I mean, it's completely not true that Israelis can somehow wander and get lost. And I've gotten lost, and I've driven with friends, and I've gotten lost, and people were nothing but kind and generous. Now, if a soldier goes in, then he's not lost. That's different. I'm not talking about somebody walking in uniform. I'm talking about somebody who goes in. It's not the same for Palestinians. Palestinians walking around Tel Aviv are suspects, and they have to worry for their lives, because if they take a wrong turn, if they speed a little bit, if they go in the wrong direction, if they look at somebody funny, they will find themselves dead. So there's no symmetry here at all.
Hmm.
Although this is kind of the prevailing narrative, it's really not. It doesn't stand the test of truth and the test of reality. But Israelis don't want to know. That's the problem. Israelis don't want to know. Israelis are happy living in their bubble in this apartheid state. And if we take a look now, all these months where Israelis have been protesting in the streets. Now, granted, these are the kind of the privileged parts of the Israeli society that are protesting. You know, Pilots, officers who are like the cream of the crop, people who are wealthy, people who are the upper echelons of Israeli society. And they've never been out in the streets. They could be out in the streets demanding ending the siege on Gaza, which is a cruel, brutal, unnecessary siege where 2 million people are kept in an open air prison without access to clean water, without access to medical care, without access to proper food, and are being bombed regularly by
Hmm.
Israel. You never see hundreds of thousands of Israelis. You never see the Israeli pilots refusing, saying, we will not do this. We will not bomb. We will not drop tons of bombs on civilian population in Gaza. You never see that. They could be in the streets, hundreds of thousands of them, as they are now, demanding justice, demanding the Palestinians get water. Palestinians do not have access to water. Where are these Israelis who are supposedly, liberal or even progressive? They don't protest for this. What they're calling for is they're concerned that their own democracy, their own life, their own privilege within the small frame of the apartheid state is being endangered. And it is, and fair enough. I'm not saying it's
Right.
not. But that's all they're worried about. So Israelis don't care. They've completely separated themselves from the reality of the people that they control and brutalize.
Yeah. Yeah, I when I was over there, it was shocking. Yeah, when I have a lot of Jewish friends, and they go to Israel, they love Israel, they're Zionists in a way, and they would say to me, "Well, you're not getting the other side of the story. You only went to the West Bank, you only got the Palestinian side. You're not seeing our side or hearing our side." And no one told me any stories. I wasn't on a guided tour of storytelling. They just showed me places. They just took me around, and I followed Palestinians around and went through checkpoints and went to their cities and ate in their restaurants. And, there was beautiful, it went to the Dead Sea, floated in the Dead Sea, things, just went and experienced it. And when you're there experiencing it with Palestinians, and you have to go through what they have to go through each day, and the guns in the faces and checking the bags. And I mean, it's traumatizing. It's totally and completely traumatizing, seeing that the water's only available a few days a week and they're filling up these big tanks filled with water. It is totally traumatizing. Then you go over to Israel and they've got lush green lawns because they're watering them all the time, and it's beautiful and wonderful, and it's just like a European area. And then you go over to the West Bank and it's a completely different world, and they're just right next door to each other. It was completely traumatizing. So I want to get into the two-state solution and the one-state solution issue here, because the argument is, and from what I saw, I did witness a lot of hostility between both groups. I mean, I went to Hebron. I mean, and you see these like real ultra settler, right? Ultra crazy Zionist settlers who were like yelling at me because they could tell that I was with Palestinian groups to show
Right.
what was really going on. And they were angry that I was there to see that. And then I also did see some hostile Palestinians that I felt, I felt fear several times while over there from all sides, because it's an extreme mentalities that we don't experience here in the United States in our bubble. We think we have extremes here, right? We think that we have this like far right extreme and far left extreme in America. We don't know extreme until we go over there, and then you see extreme mentalities that you only have read in history books in America about how the founding of this country happened.
Yeah.
But how do you reconcile that? How would you make a one-state solution when you do have a demographics issue? So when you're an Israeli and you're sitting there and you're thinking about this logically, there's more of them, especially if you let the right of return, all the refugees come back. Now you've got a demographic issue. And do you think, in all honesty, that if it was a one-state democratic situation, that the Palestinians would, if there's more of them and they're voting, do you think that, what's the first thing they would do? In my mind, the first thing they would do is change the name to Palestine. They'd be like, well, Israel's over. This is now Palestine. There's more of us than you. And so that's what we're doing. First things first.
Okay. All right. So what? Anybody doesn't
Okay.
want to live, any Jewish person that doesn't want to live in Palestine can take their bags and go somewhere else. They are in
So
Palestine. The fact that they changed the name in 1948 didn't make it stop being Palestine. It still is Palestine. It was
right.
Palestine going back for thousands of years. And so if anybody is uncomfortable living with an Arab majority, what the hell are they doing coming to colonize an Arab country?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's just the way it is. They don't like it. They can go somewhere else. The reality is this, Kim, look, there's no choice. The choice is not one state, two state, because there is no scenario on earth that the state of Israel, this Zionist entity, which is founded on a racist, supremacist ideology, which is Zionism, which has been an apartheid state from day one. It was designed as an apartheid state, and the Amnesty International report from last year demonstrates with data very clearly. Of course, I knew it. Many of us knew it, a long time ago. But, very clear that it was an apartheid state from the get-go. There is no scenario that state is going to allow a Palestinian entity full independence anywhere. Number one. Number two, what they have done throughout Palestine cannot be undone. There is no place where there are only Jews and only Arabs and you can somehow splice the country. Number two, and number three, you talked about the West Bank and visiting the West Bank. If you go to Lid, where the Tel Aviv airport sits, Tel Aviv airport sits on the occupied city of Lid. There are entire neighborhoods with tens of thousands of people who have no access to water, no access to education, no access to roads, no access to anything, cannot buy a new apartment because they're Arabs. And this is right smack in the heart, and they're Israeli citizens. And this has happened in the Negev, in the south, in the Galilee, and everywhere else. So there is nothing special about the West Bank in terms of the oppression, in terms of what Palestinians are going through. It's just that it's a slightly different bureaucracy. It's a slightly different system that's doing it. So number one, it's an impossibility. Number two, even if you did, there is no place in the country where you could splice and cut. And number three, why in the world should the Zionists get 80% of the country that they stole? And the Palestinians, why should they agree to accept 20%? It is Palestine. And for 4,000 years, until May 15, 1948, that country was known and referred to as Palestine. Look at any map going back and you're going to see it referred to as Palestine. Suddenly the Zionists came, stole a country that was thriving and by the way, and in full bloom. They stole produce from the field. They stole entire cities that are already established. They stole money from people, people's money from the banks. They stole a country that was in full bloom, and then they lied about it and said, oh no, we made the desert bloom. Really? So where did the Jaffa oranges come from? And how is it that Palestinians were exporting cotton and oil and all these different things to Europe, all these hundreds and hundreds of years going back? You see, so why should Palestinians accept anything but an absolute free and democratic Palestine and the absolute right of the refugees to return? If Israelis don't want to live in a Palestinian state, if they don't want to live in a state, in a state where Palestinians are a majority, they need to get the displaced out because Palestinians are already a majority. They need to get the hell out. The only reason they're staying is because there's an apartheid regime where they feel comfortable as, as privileged people.
But they do have very different lifestyles now. I mean, many of the Christian Palestinians who are that we, most of many, if not most of the Palestinians in America, I think are Christian Palestinians that have been driven out, and they're more liberal. They share a lot of the same. They would probably vote similarly when it comes to lifestyle as the Israelis. But a lot of the Palestinians that are there now are very very conservative Muslim. And they would want a different lifestyle with different laws. So you would then create a situation. Well, I mean, you shrug your shoulders, but that's a serious. But that's a serious shift. Well, you've got all these people living in Tel Aviv. You've got all these people that are living in Israel, and I sympathize with that. They can't help that they were born there. I mean, look, like I'm an American born in America, but America was once, same thing. I mean, the same. What I saw in the West Bank was very clear what America did to the natives, right? It was obvious what was happening there was really, like you said, there's no desire for a two-state solution or any solution. The real goal is to take over all of it. Maybe some Palestinians will live in little Palestinian reservations. That's what it kind of looks like is happening. And it's like, okay, we'll give you this little reservation, but ultimately you're living in the United States of America, and you've got like some native land, kind of whatever. That's clearly what it looks like they're actually attempting to do. And they're making their lives so miserable. They want the Palestinians to just go. Like, look, why stay here? You don't get running water and you only get it 3 days a week. Why don't you just go live in Jordan? Or why don't you just go immigrate to America or immigrate somewhere? Just get out of here so that we can have this land, right? That's like pretty clear what's happening. But it's already been done in a bunch of the country. And it's like, we can't return America back to the natives and say, well, if we don't want to live here, then just pack our bags and get out.
But that's not a fair comparison either. And I'll tell you why. Even South Africa is not a fair comparison, even though it's the closest in many ways. So what do we have when we look at Palestine, the entire country, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, from the northern border with Syria and Lebanon to the Gulf of Aqaba? There are about 12 million people living there. There are about 7 million Palestinians, about 6 million Israelis. Now, Israelis can live anywhere they want, and they live, kind of a full democracy. They have all the rights, they have protection under the law. Palestinians have no protection under the law, and they live in 3 or 4 different realities, different legal bureaucracies.
Right.
So you've got the citizens of Israel, about 2 million of them. Some of them who live in the Nakab live under a bureaucracy, their own bureaucracy with their own law enforcement, which is designed to kick out the Palestinian Bedouin and deprive them of water and so forth, and live in terrible conditions. Then you've got the Palestinians in Jerusalem, who don't really have rights. I have friends whose families have been in Jerusalem for over 800 years, documented 800 years in Jerusalem. And if they leave, they lose their land, they lose their right. My grandparents immigrated. I've been gone for all these years. I can go back tomorrow and live there. So, and then you've got the West Bank, and then you've got Gaza, and within the West Bank, you've got Area A, B, and C. This really complicated, reality in which Palestinians live. But at the same time, you have 2 people, Israelis and Palestinians, who are highly educated and have traditions of democracy and can get to work tomorrow morning. If apartheid fell tomorrow morning, if an Israeli prime minister, just like de Klerk did in South Africa, Israeli prime minister stood up and said, we are unbanning all the political parties so anybody can run. We're releasing the thousands of political prisoners, and they can be free to run for office, do what they want. And we're calling for a 1 person, 1 vote election in 6 months. That would basically mean the fall of Zionism, the end of
Israel.
apartheid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
But the
the
end of
next day,
Israel.
so
Like we have to be realistic about that. That would be the end of
of course it
Israel.
would. Of
Yeah,
course,
that would
Israel
be.
is
Okay.
Israel is a synonymous to apartheid. The fact that they gave it a pretty name doesn't make it legitimate. I refuse to
Sure.
call the country by the name Israel. I think it legitimizes a terrible crime. When people ask me where I'm from, even though I'm an Israeli, obviously I say Palestine. Now, if you had these elections, kind of let me kind of finish that thought. If you had these elections in 6 months, you'd have to divide the country into voting districts because right now there are no voting districts, so it's not really a representative democracy. Israel is all one voting district for many reasons. I won't get into that. And a district would have to be mixed Israelis and Palestinians because the population live, even though they live in such different realities, like you said, they basically geographically live very close together. So let's say
Yeah.
I'm a Palestinian and I have a neighbor who's an Israeli and we have to go vote. Are we going to vote for someone who's offering us good roads, good schools, good hospitals, low taxes? Or are we going to vote purely on nationalistic lines? Some people will. Some people will pick the latter. But I
Hmm.
bet you the majority of the people will choose the former because people want to live. They want good schools, good roads, low taxes. They want the lights to go on, the water to go on, the faucets, and that's it. So
Right.
that's how you create a democracy. That's how you take two sides that have been at odds for all these years and you demonstrate their common interest. You demonstrate the commonality. More than half Israelis have Arab backgrounds. They speak Arabic at home, they listen to Arabic music, and they eat Iraqi food or Moroccan food or Syrian food and so on. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like I said, more than half Israelis are actually Arabs. So the thing is, do you maintain the apartheid and make sure that one side is privileged while the other side is down as low as could possibly be? And right now, what we're seeing, the finance minister froze hundreds of millions of dollars of budgets that are supposed to go to Palestinian municipalities within Israel, within 1948, where Palestinian citizens of Israel live. Hundreds of millions that were supposed to go to, that were promised these municipalities. And he allocated hundreds of millions more to developing the settlements in the West Bank that already exist, adding infrastructure and road and so on and so forth. This is
Hmm.
happening just now. As Hakeem Jeffries or everybody from Hakeem Jeffries to Ron DeSantis to RFK Jr. are all hailing this Jewish democracy. They passed a law that says that if I rape a Jewish woman, I get a lesser sentence than an Arab, a Palestinian who rapes a Jewish woman. As these laws are being passed, as these budgets are being passed, as thousands of Palestinians are being are imprisoned as political prisoners, as millions of Palestinians are denied rights, denied water, their children are being killed on a regular basis, on a daily basis. These people, again, from RFK Jr. all the way to DeSantis and Trump, are hailing this democracy.
Yeah.
It's absurd. It has never been a democracy, and it's time to start talking about this nonsense and stop sending billions of dollars to this racist apartheid state, which, by the way, like I said, has never been a democracy. But regardless of that, is a rich country and doesn't need foreign aid.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's
That's
some
for
kind of a
sure.
madness in America.
Right.
There's some
There
kind of a
is.
madness here.
It, you
You
know,
know, and if you
I've
allow
tried
me,
to. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, if you allow me, just let me give one more example, okay? Betty McCollum, wonderful congresswoman. She's been working on this bill for years, a bill to protect Palestinian children from detention and torture by the Israeli authorities, right? So I was at an event here where she spoke here in DC. So she talked about the bill. It's an important bill. She can't get more than 30 co-sponsors, but that's just the reality in Congress. But then she talks about how Israel is a democracy and a friend. If Israel was a democracy, we wouldn't need her bill.
Yeah.
In a country where you need to pass a bill to protect children from detention and torture cannot possibly be a democracy. What is she talking about? What is wrong with these politicians that they always have to show that they actually, at the end of the day, they love Israel above all? That has got to stop. That
Yeah.
has got to stop.
What do you think it is that's causing that? Because that is so odd. I mean, one of my criticisms of RFK Jr., and I like him on so many points, except on the Israel issue, I feel like I see more pictures of him with the Israel flag than with the U.S. flag. It's just, and then as you mentioned, Hakeem Jeffries, who's next in line to be the new Nancy Pelosi if Democrats take over the House, he goes on a trip, takes a bunch of members of Congress, declares his love and loyalty to Israel. We have to sign loyalty pledges to Israel, guarantees that we won't support BDS. Ron DeSantis goes and takes a trip. He won't interview on shows where he thinks the person is not supportive of Israel. What do you think it is that is causing? What's behind that? Do you think that it is just the Christian idea? Because United States is a Christian, predominantly been a Christian country, and I was Mormon for many years, which is a Zionist. Mormons are Zion. I mean, they've got the Bank of Zion. You go anywhere in Utah, you're going to see Zion everywhere. And the idea is that the second coming, in order for Christ to come back, the Jews need to go back to the Holy Land, and this will trigger then the second coming. And I think that is where a lot of American Christians are, it's really, if the Jews actually paid attention, which I think they do, but they just don't care, like the Zionists, right? They're like, yeah, okay, so you think that you need my destruction ultimately, because ultimately the prophecy is you need the destruction, these wars that break out in the destruction ultimately in order for the second coming of Christ. But you've got all these Christian Zionists who are very, very pushing, very much pushing for that. Do you think it stems from that religious viewpoint, or is it AIPAC and their money? Is it just like, is there a monetary control, or do you think it's like religious control?
Well, I think people underestimate when we say the Israeli lobby or the Zionist lobby. The religious aspect of it exists, of course,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's the main part of it. I think the main part of it is this. The Zionists learned long ago, before there was an Israel, like in the days of when my grandfather was traveling and others were traveling around the world, pushing for Zionism, promoting Zionism, they understood that in America, all politics is local. So what we see today, or what's important today, is not the lobbyist in suits here at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. It's, the work that is being done at every city, every town, every school board, every state, making sure, you run for school board, you're going to get invited to a trip to Israel. You run for city council, even a tiny city or mayor, you're going to get invited. Police chiefs. So they've developed a really good connection with the media, with philanthropy, with I lived in San Diego. The Jacobs family is like hugely everything in San Diego is Jacobs. They saved the San Diego Symphony. I mean, they did a lot of great things. Strongly Zionist family. That is one way, a strong, very powerful way to influence. Again, the junkets that any elected official gets to go to Israel. So they start at the local level. And I was thinking to myself once, why would I lived in Coronado, California, adjacent to San Diego, and I thought, why are they inviting city council members of this tiny town? Why are they spending all this money, millions of dollars, to send these members of the city council to Israel? Well, because a member of the city council might run for state office, and then they might run for national office. This work begins, and they've got non-profit NGOs around the country that check social studies textbooks to make sure that they're teaching what the Zionists want taught, and they provide teachers with curriculum, and they provide them with all this glossy material, and they get continuing education units if they come to these workshops that are run by these Zionist organizations, and on and on and on. So the work is done on a very, very basic level, and then moves up from there, and they've been doing it for over 100 years, and they're very good at it. So today a guy like me shows up, I've got this the Zionist lineage, and I'm saying, excuse me, it's all a damn lie. Open your eyes, people. You've been bushwhacked. Well, not number one, why would they believe me? Number two, it's not a lot of people like to change their mind on something that's so fundamental. Plus, somebody's got, and there's this misunderstanding here in America, which, by the way, it's a pitfall that that RFK fell into, RFK Jr., which is to say, if somebody accused you of anti-Semitism, the resort is to say, I love Israel.
Right.
The two are not related.
Right.
It's not related. If
Right.
somebody accuses you of racism, you've got to show that you're not a racist. Anti-Semitism happens to be racism directed at Jews, but racism is racism. Okay, so if somebody accused me of racism, I need to show that I believe in tolerance, that I work for tolerance, that I educate my children to tolerance, that I provide any means possible for people to understand that tolerance has to be the reality in every environment. Not supporting a country that is a racist, violent country that is imposing racist laws and a racist regime against another people. It's like you said earlier, people say that the Israel is a response to the Holocaust. That's absurd. That's absurd. Why did the majority of Holocaust survivors not go to Israel? Only a very
Right.
small percentage, less than 10%, 5% of Holocaust survivors went there. Why? Because the answer to racism is not more racism.
Yeah.
The answer to genocide of the Jews in Europe is not going and committing a crime against humanity against another people. That's not the answer. So we have to put this thing in perspective. And Americans need to realize that, number one, they're being bushwhacked. Number two, they're spending a lot of money, more than on any other country. And they need to know where it's going and what's going on and why this money is being spent and why it's wrong. And you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's not about anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Zionism is just as wrong and just as racist as anti-Semitism.
Right.
If you oppose anti-Semitism, if you oppose racism, you must oppose Zionism. You must
Yeah.
oppose Zionism with every breath you have, because that's a form, in a very violent form, as we've seen, and a very persistent form of racism.
Yeah, we don't really seem to tolerate any other country in the world that would say we're only a country for this one group of people, right? Like this only, and anybody else who's not that happens to live within our borders is getting a second class
Yeah.
citizenship. We would say that's racist if we were to say, oh, America's just a white country, only white people, and anybody who's not white, you can live here, sort of, but you're not going to get the perks of the people who are
Yeah.
just white living. That's racist, right? So that's when these members of Congress say Israel's a racist country. That is what they mean. They mean the concept of a home just for one group of people is a racist concept. There are people who are not Jews living in Israel. And what are you saying to them when you say this is a home for Jews? Then not for you. Even though you were born and raised here and your family's been here for 800 years, it's not for you. That is fundamentally a racist concept. So I think, when people can get past there's like a lot, the feeling of, but the Jewish people had these horrible things happen to them, and I sympathize with the Jewish people. When they could get past that, the empathy part from the Holocaust and from just thousands of years of persecution, then and just focus on the concept itself. And then also, I always say, well, Jews are perfectly safe in America. I mean, there's no reason to flee the United States. Like, you don't need to go to Israel to live. In fact, you're less safe there, right, than you are here in this country, where you're totally embraced and our neighbors, and nobody thinks anything of it. So it is, but okay, I do want to, I know we're going to run out of time, and we're never going to agree on the one state, two state solution. But I think my issue with it is I agree that Israel never should have started in the way that it started. The beginning of it was wrong. I mean, these group of people showed up and said, we're going to start taking this land. And the founding of America in that same way is wrong. The beginning of many countries happened that way, where people showed up and they were stronger and more powerful, and they started shoving out people who were less powerful because they wanted the resources, they wanted the land. I do think that's wrong. Historically, it happens all the time. So I can agree with that. I agree that the goal is to take all of the land. But I also think, what's done is done. There's a huge group of Israelis now there living their lives. People have been born and raised there. That is their home too now. Whether they
nobody rejects that, by the way.
Right.
Nobody
Okay,
rejects that. Nobody contradicts that. Nobody's
yeah, I
talking
mean,
about kicking anybody out. We're talking about getting rid of the privilege,
well,
eliminating the racism.
but if you allow a majority that I do think has a very different worldview and they would make different laws, it would shove a lot of people out because they no longer would be welcome in their home because the laws would change on them. Or, as a woman, for example, if I were to move anywhere in the Middle East, if I had to, if I was being forced, I would move to Israel. I mean, that's just the reality of it for me as a woman. I mean,
Kim, you're assuming something that that history proves to be not true. Jews have lived in the Arab world in peace for millennia.
right,
Jews
but a
have
lot of
lived in
those,
Baghdad,
sure,
and
but
there
the
was never
Jewish.
a problem. There's no problem between Jews. There's never a problem like that at all. And Palestinians, I have to say, I know Palestinians well. Palestinians are highly educated people. And the
Right.
reality is this. Well, maybe you can tell me what's a scenario that you see that could lead to Israel allowing a Palestinian state to emerge? And number two, how much of the country do Palestinians deserve? I would say they should get at least 65% because they are the majority. So
Sure. Yeah.
Israelis would get maybe the West Bank and Gaza, and the Palestinians should get the rest. I mean, what is the scenario that you envision when you say a two-state solution? You really think Palestinians only deserve 20% of their homeland, even though they're the
No, I think
majority of
that
the
no,
population?
I think that it would have to happen the way that you even describe a one state solution in that because the argument against the two state solution is at this point it's Swiss cheese. You know, West Bank is Swiss cheese because of all the settlements that are there. And my solution to that is okay. So what? They live in Palestine now. I mean, that's those settlements are now in Palestine. If those settlers don't want to be there in Palestine, living under Palestinian rule, they can move back to Israel just across the border. They could leave, sell their homes to Palestinian families, and move. So you could carve out enough land to include the West Bank and a land strip to Gaza and all of Gaza, and you could create. So they would get definitely more land than what they have now.
And
You
this is
could
for what?
create.
What's the objective? Why is this better than just a democracy with equal rights? I hate to interrupt. I'm sorry, but
No, no,
how
no.
is
I get
that
it.
better than
Because I
how is
think
that
that
better than a democracy with equal rights? When you
well,
have
they would
such
have their
we're
own
talking about highly
democracies.
educated people. We're
Well,
talking about
it's no
highly
different
educated people.
than the United States, and there's Canada, and there's Mexico. You've got different countries ruling themselves separately. We don't have to mix all together. So if you make these borders, then you're creating another nation that can then decide how they want to govern themselves, if they want to have a democracy or not. It's up to each individual state to decide on how they want to govern themselves. So I think that there's got to be, the issue with the Palestinian land right now is they don't have actual rights over their land, even though, yeah, supposedly they have West Bank, supposedly they have Gaza, but they don't have water rights, they don't have air rights, they don't have really, and they don't even have rights of the land going from point A to point A because you got to go through B and C, right, to get there, and that's got a bunch of Israeli soldiers controlling it.
But
So
how
they
do you
don't
see
even
an
really
Israel that
have.
agrees to this? How do you
Well, they
see
would
an
just
Israel
have
that
to.
agrees
I,
to
I
this?
don't I don't see an Israel
How?
agreeing to a one state solution. That's what I really don't
No, of
see.
course not. That would happen as
So
a
then
result of
so then it's
sanctions and
so then it's a
boycotts. Of course
solution
not.
that's not tenable. It's not a realistic solution to tell
Of
even
course
the
it is.
Palestinians. You're going to have to live with a bunch of Israelis, and the Israelis to be told you have to live with a bunch of Palestinians when they've had this history of
Yeah.
not liking each other. I think there was a time
Well,
you
what
could
about
make that happen, but the older generation, I think, has fond memories of getting along, but the younger generation doesn't. And they have not gotten along. They don't remember that. They've never experienced that. So I don't think they would agree to that.
Kim? You have to take one more thing here into consideration. Zionism is a racist ideology that sees this issue as a zero-sum game.
Right.
The country belongs not to Israelis. Israel is not the state of Israelis. There's no Israeli nation. There's no Israeli ID. In our ID, it says Jewish. Zionists believe that the land of Israel, all of it, which is Palestine, belongs to the Jewish people. The state of Israel couldn't decide this, because of the ideology, because the state of Israel exists as a result of this racist ideology. They couldn't get up one day and say, well, we're going to allow the Palestinians to carve out their own piece of country, whatever, I don't know, 30%, 20%, 50, I don't know where, how much or how, to do this, because we're only the caretakers. It belongs to the Jewish people, all of it. Hebron belongs to the Jewish people. And
Right. But
Jerusalem,
that's
of
only an
course, belongs to the Jewish
ideology.
people.
But that's an
Yeah, but that's the
ideology that could be
ideology
given up.
that
But that could be given up. Israel
no,
doesn't have to be Zionist. Israel can be
of course it
Israel.
does.
It doesn't
No,
have to be. It could just be a
of
country
course it
that's
has to
filled with the
be.
people that are
No.
already there, and it doesn't have to be
So that is a single
Zionist.
democracy with equal rights. Exactly. So now it becomes a single democracy with equal rights. It's no longer a Jewish
Well,
state.
not
It's a
quite,
state of
because
all
it's
its
like,
citizens.
but it's like saying Saudi
Let me tell you
Arabia,
something. When
they have
when
very
members
different
of
rules and laws.
when members of the okay, don't take Saudi Arabia into consideration here because Palestinians are not.
Some of
It's a
them are very,
monarchy.
well,
They live in.
a lot of them
It's not like
are,
this. No,
well, a lot of
Palestinians
them
are not.
are.
This is yeah.
The Palestinians are
The
very
reality
different, as far as
the
like real
reality
liberal ones and real
reality
conservative.
the the expectation that there's a scenario that the state of Israel will allow something like this to happen. And look, we have a 75-year history. We're not talking about dreaming this up. Israel
Right.
could have had done this a long time ago, and they chose by design to make that possibility an impossibility. They pushed hard to make sure that that never happens. And they said it blatantly. They didn't hide it. They said, this is a part of our land. This is a part of Israel. It will always be a part of Israel. Palestinians can remain if they promise to be good residents without right, or they can fight and
Right.
die or leave. Those are the three choices. So the expectation that somehow there will be an Israel that would not be Zionist, then you can't be in Israel if you're not Zionist. Zionism is what Israel is. Then now we're talking about a state of all of its citizens. Palestinian politicians who live within the realm of the state of Israel, who, some of the members of Knesset and so forth,
Right.
they tried to add a law to the Israeli basic laws, an equality clause, that says that all citizens are equal. And that was rejected. They did
Right.
not want an equality clause, even within the context of the Jewish state. So if we're talking about full equality, we're talking about full equality. And if we're talking about full equality, it cannot be a Zionist state, because Zionism is a racist state. And if it's not a Zionist state, and we call for elections, then of course they're going to want to change the name, because the name Israel doesn't belong in that place. It's Palestine. So
Right.
again, this idea that somehow you could have an Israel that's not an Israel, and it would be a democracy, and then you have to carve out space for Palestinians on some of that country, it just doesn't make sense, Kim. It's just too complicated for such a small country.
Well,
The simplest, most realistic solution, if we disagree with the violence, if we disagree with the
right.
racism, if we oppose it with apartheid, if we want to divorce ourselves from apartheid, is an equal rights, one person, one vote. And you can see, I'm telling you, this country can go to work tomorrow morning as being one of the most productive democracies the world has ever seen, with Israelis
Right.
and Palestinians living together and operating this state together.
Well, I agree that the ideal solution would be for peace and harmony, for everybody to be working together and living next to each other, if they could do that. I do think that you could probably shove Israel into a position where they have no choice but to accept, the same way that Israel tried to push the Palestinians into this situation where you have no choice but to accept this little land we've carved out for you, and that's what you're going to get. I think if the alternative, if you presented Israel with the options and you say, look, it's either a one state solution and there's going to be a right to return and you're going to be outnumbered and you're going to be living in Palestine. So either pack your bags or don't. I think if you give them that option, or you say, or you could drop the Zionism, we could carve out this area of land that you could control yourselves, just this area, and you can live there with your liberal, however liberal you want to be. And you don't have to worry about maybe more conservative laws seeping in or whatever. I think they might accept that in the same way. But then again, I don't know. The Palestinians didn't really accept that very well either.
Why give them that? Why give them that option? Why give them that option? The majority of the population are Palestinians. This country has been Palestine going back as far in history as we can remember, as is recorded. Why in the world give a group of racist colonizers the right to govern and make decisions about the country that they stole? I don't see the logic in this. I mean, there's a case now in the Israeli press where a bus driver told a woman she can't sit among the men because, God forbid, it would. These are Jewish men, so she had to go sit in the back. And these are all
Yeah.
within the Israeli society. Israeli society is racist and violent and ultra religious in the worst possible way. I go on Palestinian buses all the time. I've never seen once that somebody told a woman to get up and sit in the back because a man didn't want to sit next to her. I've never seen that. And I take Palestinian buses and taxis all the time.
Right.
I've never seen a
Right.
man say, well, I'm not going to sit next to you. If he doesn't want to sit next to her, he'll wait for the next cab. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So this idea that somehow Palestinians are more dangerous, more conservative, more religious, more extreme
Well, not more
is a myth.
dangerous,
It's
but
not true.
but more conservative. I mean, I'd say it's like
Not true.
America. We've got conservative areas and we have liberal
Yeah,
areas,
I mean, you've got
and
the whole spectrum. You've got
you
the.
do
Let me
have the
tell you, I'm an
spectrum.
Israeli.
Yeah.
When I step on a Palestinian bus, everybody knows that I'm an Israeli or an American.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, I'm not one of them. Okay, nobody ever got up. Nobody ever made me feel different or bad or anything. And if I start talking within 5 seconds, they know I'm an Israeli. I mean, people know. I mean, we know each other so well. I've never once, and I don't know anybody else who's done this who's made to feel bad.
Right.
And so, I think this perception that somehow Israelis deserve their own place because they're a little bit more liberal,
It's not
because
that
they
they
maybe
deserve it. It's just
I
that
don't think
they're there.
it
And
holds water.
I just don't think they
They're there.
deserve, it's not that they deserve it. It's just that I don't think they deserve to have to suddenly, just like I wouldn't like my laws around me to suddenly change, in
Why would
one
they
direction or
change?
the other. Well,
Look,
because I
Israel
think
doesn't
that
even
there's a
have it.
difference in
Even
viewpoint.
Israel, we don't know that. That again, history hasn't shown that there's been any difference because, like I said, Jews lived in Arab countries and they got along very well with their neighbors, even in Palestine
Right.
before 1948. So I don't know that that's true. Number one, and number two, they wanted to outlaw the sound of the call to prayer. Settlers did because it wakes them up at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
And they said, look, in Europe they outlawed it, and that's perfectly fine. Well, you came from Europe here. Don't bring Europe
Right.
to the Middle East. You don't
Right.
like the sound of the adhan in the morning? Goodbye. Get the hell
Right.
out. What are you talking about? This is a Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, majority Muslim country. If you don't like it, leave. Now, having said that, let me tell you, the possibility, this again, the stereotype that somehow Palestinians are, somehow likely to distort this perfect Tel Aviv atmosphere that Israelis enjoy. You've been to Ramallah. Ramallah is no less fun than Tel Aviv. And it's,
Right.
there's no Israelis there now. It's full of Palestinians. And Bethlehem is just as fun as Tel Aviv, and so forth. So you're going to have places that are more conservative, places that are less conservative. But to
Yeah.
use that as a reason to push forward a particular perspective, a political perspective, that somehow prioritizes the values of people who came from other places is, I think it's complicates things to a point where it's never going to happen.
Yeah,
So
I mean, you're
again, I say
probably
if we
right
put our
that
energies,
different regions would have different laws, just like we have in
yeah, I
America.
mean,
We're one
of
country.
course,
But you're right. There's probably, I mean,
well,
definitely
people,
Ramallah is a more liberal Palestinian, but it's a Christian Palestinian city.
yeah, but it's a
So
majority
it's
Muslim.
different.
It used to be a
Well,
Christian. It
now,
used to be
yeah,
a Christian
yeah,
city.
right, yeah,
It's
but it's still
there's no
run
such thing
by
as Christian. They're all majority Muslims, and
right.
the thing is, let's wait and see. I mean, you think there are Palestinians that don't hate the fact that there are extremist religions, religious people within them? They don't like that either. You're going to have
Right,
the full broad
right,
spectrum, and I think a democracy with equal rights that recognizes the rights of Palestinians, their historic rights, recognizes the rights of Israelis who are now there as Israelis, like you said, they were born there, they're raised there, this is their home, recognizes both of these, and has a constitution that grants protections to everybody, regardless of their race or religion or their, if they're a minority or not. That's the only way. That's the only way that you can move forward in this place.
yeah,
Or you just continue, because Israel will never allow. It's going to be either the fall of Zionism, like the fall of apartheid in South Africa, and replacing it with something better, or different versions of this.
yeah.
That's what
I
history has
mean,
shown us. We have a
I,
75-year
and
history.
right. I think the best argument against a two-state solution is that Zionism will never stop, and they have an idea to expand and continue to expand, and it even goes beyond the West Bank.
Yes.
It goes
Yes.
quite further if you really look at the true biblical land of what is
Yeah.
supposed to be the Holy Land, right? It takes up quite a bit
Yeah.
of other areas. So I do think that's the best argument.
Yeah.
It's like halt it in its tracks before it gets to that point, potentially, before it swallows up
Yeah.
everything. I agree. That could,
Well,
I think
good. I'm glad
that's
we end up with, we're
Mika.
moving forward here. We're
Yeah,
moving
right.
forward here.
Okay, I could, but I do appreciate your viewpoint on that. Ultimately, I think we agree that we don't like what's going on over there right now, for sure, and it has to end
Yeah.
somehow. It
Yeah.
has to
Yeah.
end. That the
Yeah.
Palestinian people cannot continue to be treated the way they're being treated, and then of course they defend themselves and retaliate. Any human
Yeah.
would, if they're being pushed and harmed, and they're watching what's happening to their families and their homes happen. Any human would become a martyr, what one man's martyr, another man's terrorist, or whatever,
Yeah.
however
Yeah.
you want to label them.
Absolutely.
Anybody would fight to defend their family and their homes. And we just have been told that those people are terrorists in this country. That's what we've been taught and told. And you and I have seen something
Can
very
I
different.
tell you
Yeah.
just a little anecdote? So I was in Florence last spring, and they had an exhibit of Donatello and his sculptures. The sculptor Donatello, and the two major figures that the two major sculptures that he created. One is a King David, which is very famous, and one is Saint George. And I was sitting there in this magnificent Florentine, villa, while looking at this exhibit, and it's Florence is gorgeous. And it suddenly dawned on me that those two figures have something in common. And I ask people this all the time, and most people don't know. So I'll just say it. St. George is a Palestinian from the city of Lid, and he's buried in Lid. King David is a Palestinian from Bethlehem. These two, towering figures of Western civilization, St. George and King David, are both Palestinians, not to mention Jesus. They're
Not
both
to mention
Palestinians.
Jesus. Right. Oh, you
So, let's
sounds
talk
like
about the
you've
history.
got,
Let's talk about the culture. I got something
yeah.
going here.
Yeah, you've got an injured child in there, so we're gonna
I
let
do,
you
somebody fell down.
we're gonna let you
Oh,
take care of that. Miko, really a pleasure chatting with you and
hey,
getting your
thank you so
perspective.
much for the
Definitely
opportunity.
appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here.
Bye.